Hey, thanks for clicking. If you choose the Age of Stars ending, the Tarnished gets to marry Ranni, and unlike in Dark Souls 3, the game doesn't force a hetero wedding. So if you play as a woman, you and your new moonwife can be space lesbians for the next millennium. In fact, if you play as Type B, every single ending except the Frenzied Flame technically ends in a lesbian marriage. See, in the 4 endings where you mend the Elden Ring, you become the consort of Queen Marika, though it's unclear if Marika is sentient or even alive at that point. Since male and female Tarnished can both marry Marika and Ranni, those two characters could be considered bisexual. I identified every romantic relationship in the game, both straight and queer. I also analyzed these relationships to see which ones involved characters who agreed to be in the relationship and are still in the relationship at the end. Marrying Ranni is one of the very few relationships that isn't toxic or ends in tragedy in the lands between. And since Ranni and the Tarnished are both alive and want to date each other at the end, that technically means half of all the non-toxic relationships in the game can be queer. That's pretty good. The other relationship that met both criteria was the power couple of the Volcano Manor, Rykard and Tanith. Even after you defeat him, it seems that Rykard is still alive, and Tanith is still devoted to him. What's also fascinating is that an earlier version of the game confirmed Rykard as bisexual. In the 1.0 text for Datakar's Woe, instead of being the mother of Zorias, Datakar was the name of a soft-featured man who was one of Rykard's dedicated paramours. But this item description was ultimately cut. I suppose it's fitting that an example of bisexuality also became an example of bi-erasure. I have mixed feelings about this. On the one hand, Rykard would make for an absolute icon for disaster buys. But on the other hand, I can appreciate the fact that FromSoft decided they did not need to have a second queer man who's a demigod and an allegory for Satan. Let's talk about Mohg and Miquella. Here's a quick recap for the lore. Mohg and his twin brother, Morgoth, were born to Marika and Godfrey. As omens, they were disowned by their parents, shackled, and locked in the sewers beneath Leyndell. After Marika exiled Godfrey, she married Radagon and had another set of twins, Miquella and Malenia. Miquella was afflicted with eternal youth, while Malenia was infected with the Scarlet Rot. And when Golden Order fundamentalism could do nothing to treat Malenia, Miquella abandoned that doctrine and became fascinated by unalloyed gold. Later, Miquella decided to grow the Halig tree by watering it with his own blood. As the Halig tree grew, Miquella cocooned himself inside. But before Miquella was finished, he was kidnapped by Mohg. Mohg wanted to create a new order, but to do so, he needed an Empyrean to replace Marika. According to Ranni, there were only 3 demigod Empyreans, Ranni, Miquella, and Malenia. But Ranni slew her own Empyrean flesh, and so she presumably would not be able to start a new dynasty. And Malenia is Malenia. So Miquella was really Mohg's only option to create a new dynasty. Now, to set the record gay, yes, Mohg is having sex with Miquella. The game is about as explicit as FromSoft gets. As we learned from Mohg's remembrance, wishing to raise Miquella to full godhood, Mohg wished to become his consort, taking the role of monarch. But no matter how much of his bloody bedchamber he tried to share, he received no response from the young Empyrean. In the original Japanese, this kanji is used, which can refer to a bedroom used by a married couple. We also see Mohg taking Miquella's hand and calling him dearest, which mirrors Ranni calling us her dear consort in the Age of Stars ending. While consort doesn't necessarily have a sexual connotation, for Mohg, he wants to create a new dynasty, and so he needs a bloodline. Speaking of blood, since Mohg drips out of the cocoon into a pool of blood, the Tarnished is basically walking in on him having sex with Miquella. And to top it all off, in cut content, Mohg literally shouts, "Sex!" Now, astute viewers may have noticed a flaw in Mohg's plan. Miquella is a dude. Since this is a fantasy game, reproduction could work differently when it comes to the Empyreans. I've also seen a few theories that Miquella himself could be transmasculine. This would explain how Miquella is the alter ego for Saint Trina, and would be able to give birth despite being identified as male. But founding a new dynasty wasn't the only reason why Mohg took Miquella. I also think that snatching Miquella was a preemptive attack to defend the Formless Mother. and let her continue to interfere with the lands between. From the Mohgwyn Sacred Spear, we learn that Mohg communes with the Formless Mother, an outer god, and Miquella was working on a needle that could ward off the meddling of outer gods. Initially, this needle was aimed at the outer god of rot, but since it also works on the Flame of Frenzy, it's not a leap to think it would work on the Formless Mother as well. In addition, a human Justicor pointed out that Miquella was essentially practicing a form of blood magic by watering the Haligtree with his own blood. All that bloodletting most likely caught the attention of the Formless Mother. It's also quite possible that Miquella, while cocooned, may have accidentally bewitched Mohg, who in turn became obsessed with getting that Mikosi. Despite his appearance, Miquella is linked with seductive power. The description for Melania's armor says that Miquella has the allure of a god, and the kanji used for allure can also be translated as temptation or seduction. The kanji is also used in the bewitching branches, which say that Miquella has learned to compel affection. So if a single bewitching branch can control minds, just imagine the power of a fully operational Haligtree. This bewitching theory is supported by a cut line of dialogue that makes Mohg sound absolutely pathetic.
Miquella, why do you abandon me?
Again, this is cut content, but to me it sounds like Miquella could have actually had the upper hand. In addition, Mohg and Miquella have parallels to a type of dynamic that was not uncommon in Japan. During the Edo period in Japan, it was seen as a mark of sophistication for older men to have sex with younger males, who were known as wakashu. Some of Japan's most powerful samurai and shoguns, like Oda Nobunaga and Miyamoto Musashi, all had their own wakashu. Typically, a boy would become a wakashu around the age of 11 or 12. He would wear a girl's kimono, while his head would be shaved and given a front-locked hairstyle. From then on, a wakashu would no longer be considered a boy, but was treated more like a third gender. Conversely, a wakashu would become a man by cutting off his frontlocks and putting on a man's kimono. This coming-of-age ceremony often happened when they turned 18 or 19, though it could happen even earlier if a wakashu had too many adoring fans. But behavior and dress mattered more than age. Some wakashu could live that way well into their 20s and 30s. In fact, there were even a handful of elderly wakashu as old as 80. So in a way, Miquella presenting as a young boy, even though he's significantly older, wouldn't be too out of place in Tokugawa, Japan. And there was also a subset of wakashu known as brotherhood contracts, which was basically mentorship with benefits. Under this arrangement, a man and his wakashu would refer to each other as elder brother and younger brother, though Mohg may have taken that last part a bit too literally. The wakashu have another fascinating parallel with Mohg. To symbolize their devotion, it was not uncommon for men and wakashu to slice off parts of a finger, or to chop it off entirely, in a ritual known as shinju. For wakashu, this could help them secure a patron. Meanwhile, older men would perform shinju to get the attention of a popular and pretty wakashu or actor, who was usually a male sex worker. And in the lands between, Mohg puts his own spin on this tradition with his bloody fingers. If you do Vare's questline, he gives you festering bloody fingers to invade other players, and you yourself are called a bloody finger when you invade that way.
Be sure to try that finger I gave you.
Later in the quest, Vare injects some of the accursed blood directly into the fingernail of the Tarnished. I always interpreted this scene as Vare severing the finger before he gives it to the Tarnished as the bloody finger item. And in the 1.0 item description, it does say that the finger seems to have been chopped off. And to make the subtext text, once you become a pureblood knight, Vare says,
One day you will be elevated, deservedly, basking in love. Right, my lambkin?
Of course, items can have multiple meanings. The slicing of the fingers could also symbolize Mohg's opposition to the two fingers and Marika's golden order. Not only did Mohg's kidnapping destroy the Haligtree, it may have been the final catalyst for Marika. If you talk to Gideon, after defeating Melania, he says,
Perhaps the Queen's sorrow was justified.
This implies that Marika shattered the Elden Ring after Miquella disappeared. In any case, Marika and Miquella are easily two of the most important people in the lands between, and these characters just so happen to be the most gender-fluid and androgynous characters in the game. One of the biggest revelations hinges on Marika's gender identity. If you do the Gold Mask quest, you find out that Radagon is Marika, and in the cutscene right before we fight Radagon, we can clearly see that the two of them share one body. This twist was actually hinted at in the very first reveal trailer for the game, where we see Marika and Radagon shattering, and then trying to repair the Elden Ring. Now, one question that has bedeviled lore hunters is whether Radagon and Marika were always one person, or if they were two separate individuals who later fused together. One common argument for the latter is this spoken echo in Marika's bedchamber.
O Radagon, leal hound of the Golden Order, thou art yet to become me. Thou art yet to become a god.
Case closed. Or it would be were it not for the very next line.
Let us be shattered, both, mine other self.
And in the original Japanese, the phrase mine other self is represented by these kanji, which indicate the other half of one's body. Personally, I believe Radagon was always Marika. The strongest piece of evidence is the fact that he first appears leading the armies of the Erdtree into Leonia, a very powerful position. But at the time, he was a complete nobody. He only became a champion during the Leonian Wars. It just makes the most sense that Marika was actually the one leading her own armies, albeit in a different form. If you're curious, Smowtown has a great video that goes into even more detail. As for Miquella, like his mom, he also appears as his gendered opposite. In cut content, it's confirmed that Miquella is the same as Saint Trina, who governs sleep and dreams. According to their silver sword, Saint Trina is an enigmatic figure. Some say she is a comely young girl, others are sure he is a boy. The only certainty is that their appearance was as sudden as their disappearance. Even without that cut content, there are plenty of clues that link those two together. Both Miquella and Saint Trina are androgynous. They also have their own lilies, which look very similar to one another. And in the consecrated snowfield, which leads into Miquella's Halig tree, you can get Saint Trina's torch, one of only 2 weapons in the game named after her. There's also the fact that when you find Miquella, he is fast asleep in his cocoon, which is on top of a pair of female hip bones. But if you look inside the cocoon, Miquella is no longer a Bishonen, but now looks like an elderly orphan of cosplayer. There really hasn't been that much in the way of trans or gender-diverse representation in AAA gaming. So the fact that one of the best-selling and most critically acclaimed games has not only 1 but 2 gender-fluid characters is kind of astounding, and it's done so casually too, with very little fanfare. That said, I don't think Miyazaki and Martin set out to include gender non-conforming representation in their game. Instead, I think this was a fortunate accident of their fascination with alchemy. Alchemy was both a precursor to modern chemistry and an ancient tradition based on spiritual discovery. Alchemy was not a single school at all, so of course there can be different interpretations when it comes to their symbolism. I'll cover alchemy in more detail in a separate video, but for now I want to focus on one of the most popular symbols, the rebus. The rebus was an androgynous figure that was half man, half woman. The rebus represented the ultimate goal of alchemy, the Philosopher's Stone. Most famously, alchemists believed the stone could transform lead and other base metals into gold. But depending on the alchemist, the stone could also grant eternal life, cure disease, and bring life to plants. Symbolically, the rebus was depicted as the aftermath of the chemical wedding between Sulfur, the Red King, and Mercury, the White Queen. In some texts, the chemical wedding would produce the androgynous Philosopher's Child, which could often be another name for the Philosopher's Stone. Radagon would be the Red King, a figure that was linked with gold and the sun. Sulfur also has clear connections to smithing, which further suits Radagon. For the White Queen, I think it could be both Ranni, since the White Queen was linked to silver and the moon, though it could also be Marika. As Crunchy pointed out, Marika is literally the symbol for Mercury, a woman hanging underneath a semicircle. And I think Miquella was supposed to be a rebus, but that failed. And there are many connections between Miquella and Mercury. In alchemy, Mercury was often represented by the god Mercurius, who was associated with opposites. Mercurius was half masculine, half feminine. Sometimes Mercurius appeared as an eternal youth, other times he showed up as an old man. Perhaps most intriguing of all was Mercurius's ability to give birth to himself. In one text, Mercurius even says, "The mother bore me and is herself begotten of me." With all that in mind, I think Miquella was supposed to be a mimic of Marika. To start, Miquella does look a lot like Marika. They both have braided blonde hair and a similar frame. And as we see from Ranni and her sweetings, those born from the amber egg look like their parent. But to use the amber egg, you need a larval tear, also known as a silver tear, and quicksilver is another name for Mercury. We also don't know if Miquella ever had working legs. In the few depictions we have of him, we either see him kneeling down or snatched away in a cocoon. And if that is him in the DLC image, he's riding side saddle, just like the Albanoic archers, though that could also be the case because they're all femme. Finally, the name Miquella is a feminized version of Miquella, which means one who resembles God. You know, like a mimic. Thank you so much for watching. I'm really interested in seeing what yins have to say, and given this topic, I do hope the comment section won't turn into Caled. I also created a YouTube membership and Patreon if you'd like to support me.